Thanks for joining us for this panel, which is called How Do We Finance Energy Projects in the Future? With all of the other tutorials going on space and religion and politics, the fact that we filled this room for such a topic is pretty gratifying, so thanks for joining us. So financing energy projects, well, that's a bit more complicated topic than might appear on the surface. The concept of energy itself is an undulating animal, a true shapeshifter. That can mean all sorts of different things to many different folks, the concept of energy. And that's been brought home to me in spades over and over again as I've chaired the energy sector of this very large law firm. There's really nothing universally applicable to so-called energy projects, whether it is financing or anything else. No one size fits all. So we have upstream oil and gas development, power generation, transmission and distribution, there's solar, there's wind, there's bio, there's hydro, nuclear, pipeline development, refining, petrochemical plants, LNG, on, so many different subsets. But certainly one unyielding truth that wraps itself around all these subsets is the need for capital. And in most cases, vast amounts of capital in order to finance continued development of the sector, whether that be in the mature economies or in the developing world. And traditionally, there's been very big competition for that capital. Interestingly enough, today, money is fairly cheap. So the competition's kind of swinging the other way. Where is that money going to go? And what are the various subsets of this industry going to do to attract it? And there's so many game changers that hit this industry, whether caused by positive developments, such as the enormity of the Shale Gas Revolution in the United States, or darker circumstances, such as the Macondo blowout in the Gulf of Mexico or the Fukushima disaster in Japan. The ground always seems to shift with regularity, and today's smart money can very quickly and suddenly become tomorrow's sad story. So for those with an appetite to help finance energy projects, there are numerous thorny issues that are difficult to parse. A few examples. Will the U.S. permit large-scale export of natural gas in the form of LNG? How robust will the appetite remain for subsidizing renewables, such as wind, solar, and bio, in the face of continued low-cost natural gas? What will the long-term consequences of what now appears to be the permanent decoupling of oil and natural gas prices? They used to move around like minnows together. They've pretty much separated now. How fierce will competition remain from the emerging jurisdictions such as India and China for energy resources? Is quote-unquote peak oil really a viable concept, or have we still only scratched the surface of the recoverable hydrocarbons available on the planet? And will the US and other huge users of hydrocarbons finally look to tax emissions in a meaningful way? Or, notwithstanding President Obama's Tuesday pronouncements, does economic reality make that a non-starter? So this is but a smattering of very compelling questions that will weigh on the minds of those looking to invest and finance big energy projects. And these questions are often the gorilla in the room, even as banks and financing institutions grapple with the more mundane but very pressing issues typical of large financings, such as rate of return, exit strategy, construction risk, and the like. So stepping into this confusion is our panel, which is composed of some of the leading minds in the business. So permit me to introduce each member to you right now. Sitting immediately to my left is Kristina Mary Johnson. Dr. Johnson serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Fleet Street Energy in Washington, D.C. She's the co-founder of Enduring Energy, Inc., and she's also the co-founder of Southeast Tech and Ventures, Inc. She serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Enduring Hydro, LLC. Dr. Johnson was the Undersecretary for Energy in the Obama administration at the Department of Energy until she stepped down in 2010. And she has previously been the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. And she also was the Dean of the Pratt School of Engineering at Duke University back in the 90s. Dr. Johnson has a BS, MS, and PhD degrees in electrical engineering from Stanford. And she has also served as Director of the National Science Foundation Engineering Research Center for Optoelectronics Computing Systems at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So if that all isn't intimidating enough, and there's a lot more here, but I'll and then Sitting to Kristina's left, and
What's his name?
His old what's his name? Yeah.
What is his name?
Yeah. I mean, when I was rounding out this panel, I kind of got stumped. I had to really reach into the bottom of the barrel to come up with Jim Rogers. Everybody in the room, I'm sure, knows who he is. Jim is chairman and CEO of Duke Energy, which is the largest electric power holding company in the United States. Duke generates electricity from coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, solar, and wind, and serves 7.2 million customers. Jim is in his 25th year as an energy industry CEO. Prior to becoming utility CEO in 1988, he ran Enron's gas pipeline division. Before that, he was a partner in a major Washington, D.C. law firm. And I have to say, I'm very jealous. He moved over to the light side of things. He served as Deputy General Counsel at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He was Assistant Attorney General for the great Commonwealth of Kentucky. And there's so much more that if I kept going on with his CV, the entire hour would dissipate. So I'll stop there, but it's great to have Jim with us. And then at the end, we have Chris Hyzy. Chris is the Chief Investment Officer for U.S. Trust. He's Managing Director and Chief Investment Officer at U.S. Trust, which is part of Bank of America's wealth management group. In this role, he develops, manages, and oversees the investment process, determines the investment view of the firm, and develops and manages the asset allocation strategy and investment policies of the firm. He's also responsible for the development and execution of investment strategy, including the overall portfolio management, especially asset management, institutional investment, wealth structuring, and trading. So he's got a pretty big portfolio. Prior to joining U.S. Trust, Chris was Chief Investment Officer and Head of Product Strategy for the Latin American region for Citigroup, private bank, and he chaired the Global Investment Themes Committee at Citi. And before that, he had a 13-year tenure at Merrill Lynch, so he's hit all the big names in Wall Street. So this is our panel. And we're pretty fortunate to have people who sit on pretty different perches across the energy landscape. So we're going to get some nice perspectives. So as we get started, I just have one diversion. Some of you may be familiar with a fellow named Ambrose Bierce. In his time, which was the late 19th century, he was quite a well-known journalist and author. But he had a really biting and cynical wit. And among his great works was something called The Devil's Dictionary. I don't know if any of you have ever become familiar with it, but I certainly recommend it. And for those of you who enjoy bitingly funny social commentary, it's really a must. But an example, just to give you a flavor of some of the devil's definitions that he compiled, here's one. Bride, right? A woman with a fine prospect for happiness behind her. Liberty, one of imagination's most precious possessions. And alone, in bad company. Right? So I looked up Bierce's definition of finance. And what I found, I'm sure our panelists today will help us dispel as a non-starter, but nevertheless, for what it's worth, he defined finance as the art or science of managing revenues and resources for the best advantage of the manager. So, but enough of Mr. Bierce. What we're going to do now, as far as the structure of this, is I'm going to invite each of the panelists to give you pretty much about a 5-minute précis on what they're seeing in the energy markets, particularly with respect to financing development projects. And so they'll each give you their perspective. Then we'll launch into a few questions and discussion points that hopefully will generate some repartee among the panel members. And with about 10 minutes to go, we'll take some Q&A from the audience, okay? So with that, I'll first turn it over to Kristina and let her give you her views on what's happening out there.
Thank you very much. Let me just start by setting a bit of a context for where, thank you, my perspective is from. So when I was Undersecretary of Energy, we took the nuclear, the renewables, the fossil assistant secretaries, we got together and we decided to see what would it take to actually hit 80% clean electricity by 2035, which is one of the president's goals. And the president, in the announcement this week, really doubled down in terms of energy efficiency and decarbonizing the electric sector. I may say a few words about that as well. And then we hired BCG to say, what would it cost? So that deals with finance. So it turns out if we invested $1 trillion between now and 2035, we could hit our climate goals. Now, in terms of the big picture, what's $1 trillion? Well, it's about 40 billion a year. If you do the math, it's a grande latte a week per household, or 3 Dunkin' Donut cups of coffee per week per household. It's less, it's about half of what we spent on putting in the interstate highway system in this country. We spent about 0.46% of our gross domestic product to do that. Our plan would take about 0.23%. So the plan, simply put, is we'd have a third nuclear electricity, a third fossil, half of which would be with carbon capture, and I'll have Jim will comment on that, I'm sure, and then a third would be on renewables. So that was the big picture. So I left, and then we did a budget, 5-year budget, to try and line up the budget and the research objectives to try and achieve these accomplishments. So I left to try and bring private capital in off the sidelines to help achieve these goals. And because I knew that government alone probably would not do that, particularly now with the recession, or coming out of actually a recession. So I looked at the plan and I said, I'm not going to build a nuclear power plant. I'm probably not going to do coal or natural gas. Don't know anything about that, but I know something about hydropower. And so I've been looking at how do we finance hydropower projects for about the last 2 years. And so my comments will probably be more informed by that. But let me set the stage now for hydropower, which I think is fascinating, right? So 80% of the renewable energy in the world is from hydropower. 60% in the US of our renewables are from hydropower. We have 80,000 dams in the US. 77,000 of those do not produce electricity. So only 3% of the dams that exist produce electricity. Now, what are the dams used for? They're used for flood control. They're used for navigation if they're locks and dams. They're used for reservoir to store water. They're used for recreation. So why not get this other use out of the ones that should still stand and take down the ones that shouldn't be there? So a pretty simple proposition. If you look at one of the president's goals, which is to have the federal government have 20% of its electricity use from renewables, if we just took the majority owner of hydropower in this country is the federal government. If we just upgraded what they have, you could green half of the federal government. And if you built another 7,000 megawatts, you could green the entire electrical consumption, 100%, not just 20%, but 100% of the consumption of the US government. So huge potential. Now, let's say what has actually happened in the last 5 years. We have installed 348 megawatts in 5 years of hydropower in this country. So that's about 70 megawatts a year. In the last 3 years, we've done 60 megawatts of FERC-licensed project. Not conduit exemptions, but FERC-licensed project. I'm building right now a power plant in western Pennsylvania. It may be one of 2 power plants commissioned this year in the entire United States, and I'm a startup. So we've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years trying to figure out what are the barriers to try and build hydropower in this country at existing dams. And that has the support of American Rivers. You can go on the National Hydropower Association website, the Sierra Club Nature Conservancy. If we already have dams that exist, and they're going to be there for flood control or recreation or water conservation, why not also get electricity out of them? So, and it's a very bipartisan supported endeavor. I mean, the National Hydropower backed a bill, the word of bill that went through and was unanimously passed. I think actually the House passed it, and now there's a bill going through the Senate. So this is a very bipartisan renewable energy, and yet only 350 megawatts installed in 5 years. So the barriers tend to be you tie up capital because of the permitting process for 8 to 10 years. So FERC, which is very good, they'll give a permit for 3 years. And actually, it's a fairly low bar to get a permit. And then if you need another 3 years, you get another 3 years with the pretty low bar. And then you have 2 more years by which you have to break ground. So who wants to tie up for 8 years millions of dollars in permitting and studies? These environmental studies should be done within a year. You have to take a year because different seasons require different studies of dissolved oxygen, total dissolved gases, the kind of fish. We've developed now fish-friendly turbines. I mean, environmentally, these are very good projects. But 8 years, you cannot tie up millions of dollars because your returns go away. And no one's got that kind of patient capital. Capital may be cheap, but people still expect high returns. And I think so the first thing is we've got to cut the permitting down to 2 years. Either build it, break ground in 2 to 3 years, or abandon it. Probably wasn't meant to be built. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that 81 of the top 100 sites to build in the US are from the Army Corps. And I think that we need to, let me be bold here. We're supposed to be bold, aren't we?
Right, of course.
Okay, bold. I think one would be interesting to look at the 40,000 megawatts that are owned by the Army Corps and the Bureau of Reclamation, and why not privatize them? You'd raise probably $80 to $100 billion. You've got $100 million a year in operations and maintenance. Right now, the Army Corps assets need to be modernized and upgraded. It's going to require $6 to $10 billion over 10 years. They don't have anything in the budget for it. So if we were to privatize those, we'd raise some money, pay down the debt a little bit, and get folks that are in the private sector that can make them efficient and benefit from selling the electricity. So last thing I'd say is, first is get the permitting down. The second thing is, I did notice that you said something about the subsidies with regard to renewables, which I have to tell you really gets up my nose because, IEA, the International Energy Agency, just issued a report today that said that actually worldwide, fossil fuels get 6 times the subsidies of renewables. And I'll tell you the second thing that I would hope would happen, which could really be a game changer for all renewables, is to have Senator Coons from Delaware's MLP, Master Limited Partnership, Parity Act get passed. Because right now, the Master Limited Partnership, what that allows you to do is go to the capital markets to raise money, but not have to be taxed both at the corporate and the individual investor level.
Huge advantage.
It'd be huge, and it is huge. And right now, 80% of MLPs in this country are upstream oil and gas.
Right.
So if that were to happen, that would be huge. And then I think the third thing is that we really need to educate in terms of the risks of renewables, all renewables. So when we don't talk about the risk of geothermal or biomass or biofuels or hydro, we only talk about solar and wind. But we've got to get it together, understand what are the risks, and then match the risks with the access to the right sources of money. Some should be infrastructure, some should be private equity, some should be maybe crowdsourcing. But there's a way to do this and make it happen. But I think we also have to have people realistic that when Treasury is what? How many of us are getting 2% on our money in a bank? I'm not. So why are returns expected to be 12 to 14% unlevered? That makes no sense to me. So that's my pitch. I'd do those 2 things, and then I think financing would be easy.
Okay, great. Jim?
Let me start by saying the power sector, as many of you know, is probably the most capital-intensive industry in our country. And there is not one size fits all, because in the United States today, we have a hybrid power system. There's 19 states that are competitive markets. Yeah. And in those states, there's no new generation being built because there's no capacity market. Well, there is a capacity market. In PJM, it's for 3 years, but nobody builds a 40-year asset with a 3-year capacity market, betting on getting returns from the energy sector. So and we have operations in the competitive market, and the only thing that's being built there are renewable assets, and that's because the states have renewable portfolio standards. And so that's really it's created a really different investment opportunity. Yeah. The majority of our business is in the vertically integrated regulated business. And what we have done is that we're just completing a $9 billion modernization plan that will allow us to shut down 7,000 megawatts, or said another way, 90 coal and old oil units who are high emitting and inefficient, and fundamentally transforming the mix of generation that we have. Now, that is not happening in these competitive markets because there is no capability to do it. In the regulated market, you have a compact, you get financing cost recovery while you're building. And just our company, in spending $9 billion, we put a lot of people to work, as you might imagine, in the construction. And we put a lot of people to work in these new places, huge tax base for the people in these areas, for the schools. But the real thing that's happened here is that we are modernizing to take advantage of the Shale Gas Revolution, which is the single greatest energy transformation in the last 20 years. I mean, by far. And because it's fundamentally changed in the United States the carbon footprint of our country. One quick stat, and that is our emissions today is back to the 1992 level. We're doing a hell of a lot better than Europe in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, notwithstanding their hundreds of thousands of pages of regulation. Just the innovation on shale gas. And if you go back to 1992, the economy today is 50% bigger. We have 50 million more people, and we still have the same carbon emissions as we did in 92. So that's a great achievement attributable to shale gas. Now, in our building program, we built 5 combined cycle gas plants, 2 advanced coal plants. One is the cleanest coal plant in the world. It's a coal gasification. I won't get into the technology, but we were able to finance this entire program with only issuing $1 billion of equity and still maintaining 53% equity component in our cap structure.
Out of a $9 billion program, right? You said
$9 billion. And so it's kind of I'm not going to get into the details about how we did that, but the bottom line, the important point is, it really allowed us to achieve our government national intention of reducing emissions. And we're on our path to have 1/3 coal, 1/3 gas and renewables, and 1/3 nuclear by 2015.
That's great.
A fundamental transformation of the mix of generation. And I share that with you because it is happening only in the areas where they're vertically integrated and regulated and there are clear rules. It's not happening in the competitive markets of the United States. So in some regions of the country, we're falling behind in the modernization because by 2050, virtually every power plant in this country will be retired or replaced except hydro. Yeah. Our nuclear plants all will end their lives at 60 years between now and 2050. The question is, will we replace them? And the only part of the country where they're being built today is in the South, where they're building new plants to offset the retirement of new plants going forward. And quick stat, 70% of the carbon-free electricity in this country comes from nuclear. Yeah. Now let me tell you a little bit about our renewables business. We're the 5th largest operator of wind in the United States. And while we were doing this $9 billion modernization plan, we were investing in renewables. Not in our backyard, because the wind doesn't blow in North Carolina. It doesn't blow on the ridge lines. It does blow on the ridge lines, but I'm not going to allow us to do it because I have a house in the mountains. And on the shore, they basically, environmentalists are not going to let us build there. And the only other place where we have consistent wind in the state is around the state capitol.
Yeah, that's where that was going.
And I guarantee you, we're not going to build it. We're not going to circle Raleigh, although it needs to be circled. But my only point I'm making is that we've invested in renewables over $2.5 billion. Let me tell you how the math has worked. Because we're capital constrained as we did the modernization program. Let me just take the first 1,000 megawatts. It cost us $1.7 billion. By the time we took the tax credits and project financed it, we only had $400 million left in the project. And we were earning 15 to 17% returns off that $400 million. So that's a great example of the rotation of capital that really allowed us. Now the earnings contribution is very small for now, and we'll change that mix as we move out of the modernization program. But the very important point is those are pretty large returns, much larger than our regulated returns. So structuring of these different projects is important. The last thing I'd say about the renewables is and we're selling it to other utilities in other regions of the country where the wind blows, Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Kansas. But we're basically financing them off the balance sheet of the utility we're selling it to. Right. Because we have a 20-year contract, we take it to the bank if they like our wind turbines, and we've used 3 different kinds of wind turbines and got okays in terms of financing them. But the bottom line is you're financing it off the back of the person you're selling the power to. That's just the math and the way it works in terms of financing. So I think we have a capability in this country. And with shale gas, one last thing on shale gas is really important before I wrap it. Shale gas has fundamentally changed the way we operate our system. We dispatch always hydro first. We're the 2nd largest operator of nuclear in the country. We then dispatch nuclears. Historically, we always dispatch coal because it was cheaper next, not now. We're dispatching gas. And as a consequence of that, our emissions have dropped dramatically. Right. And at the end of the day, that is what has led to this significant reduction that came from the innovation of shale gas. And if we have time at the right point, I'd love to share with you how it happened, because it wasn't done by the majors, not Exxon, not Mobil, not Shell, but it was done by the independents. And it's a great story of American innovation and ingenuity that created one of the great revolutions in our country and great transformations.
George Mitchell.
George Mitchell, absolutely.
Yeah. So, thank you. Chris?
Thanks, Jim, Kristina. That actually is a really good segue. We didn't plan this, but that last statement is something that we recently wrote about, which is called The Transforming World. And it all has to do with, Kristina opened up, or actually closed a little bit by saying, if you're not getting 2% on your money or something, come to U.S. Trust. We'll help you get a lot more than that. But and then Jim talked a little bit about the access and capital, and just the actual chain and the innovation that's going on. And if you think about it, just investing itself, I'll take the investing angle and the economic angle to this. If you think about investing, there's an intersection between who needs what and who has what. And when you think about that, who has the capital and who needs it? And if you go around the world right now and you think about how the world is rebalancing, back in the 1990s, the U.S. consumer needed capital. The U.S. consumer needed to spend. That was the engine of growth. If you think about it in the next 10 years, 20 years, et cetera, it's the emerging market consumer. They need access to what? They need access to energy. They need access to hard assets. They don't necessarily need as much access to capital because a lot of them have it, actually. They're pretty much debt-free, and they're building mass consumer societies. So you think about how the world is rebalancing its growth curve, and then you think about who has the capital and who has the resources and where's the greatest need. There is no single greatest sector than energy infrastructure in terms of an investment opportunity over the next 10 to 20 years. There's a lot of hurdles in the way to be able to affect that. Number one, it's policy. You're going to need some policy stimulus. Extra subsidies, you're going to need a kickstart, you're going to need a little bit of HGH or steroids to get some of that capital to go and not make it a situation where all of a sudden technology after the first 3, 4, or 5 years ends up leapfrogging over into a new part of the equation, and then smart money initially becomes dumb money eventually. So that there is an element of policy that's going to be needed to change. Unfortunately, the governments around the world, because of all the debt that's out there and the debt shelf that we have, there's going to be this inertia-like movement towards policy stimulus in this front. We should fast-track a lot of things. Unfortunately, that's not in the cards right now. So the private sector is going to have to take over. Whether it's by accident or by design, that's a good thing, because the private sector is actually going to be able to affect this energy infrastructure transformation a lot better and more effective than the government side of the equation. So everybody has to work together. The way we look at it, from the standpoint of the greatest investment theme out there, if you put yourself back 3 or 4 years ago, those not in the energy space had no idea that within potentially a decade at that time, we would be energy independent. This was something that may have been uttered as an interesting thing to talk about, but certainly not a reality. And that is becoming a fast reality as the more months and quarters and years go by. That's number one. So that will change the face of how growth is produced around the world and who's going to be able to take advantage of it. That's number one. Number two, when you think about what is our greatest depletion right now in the United States, it's probably jobs and the skills needed in the jobs where there's big gaps. That happens to be in the engineering space, particularly in energy infrastructure. So all the doom and gloom about where the U.S. is headed and all the doom and gloom about the national debt and the deficits and everything else is an interesting thing to discuss, but that's thinking backward, not forward. Thinking forward is about this transformation that's going on that Kristina and Jim talked about and how to take advantage of it. From our perch, always in every transformation, the other thing to think about without question is capital will always go to the greatest risk-adjusted return, always. That will always be the case, and that happens to be in this space. The key question we have to answer potentially today and the years ahead is how do we make that capital very movable quickly in the areas of greatest concern. And again, we talked about policy. The other thing is the structure of the investment. The initial outlays of any movement, of any transformation, is always the private equity side. Largely speaking, the public side of investing generally has a lower return. It's
Yeah.
a lot more liquid, obviously,
Right.
but the ability to create and move capital into the areas of greatest need is not there in the public space. We talked about master limited partnerships. There were 14 IPOs last year. Not one had anything to do with renewables because of the
Yeah.
policy, or at least the bill that hasn't even been voted on yet. That
Right.
should happen. Meaning
let's
should,
hope.
we need it to happen.
We need it to happen,
And if that does happen, then expect the IPO market and the MLPs to go through another transformation and to see a lot of it towards renewables. That would help tremendously.
help a lot.
The second side of the equation is when you look at the private space, you've got joint ventures that go on between a producer and a manufacturer. That's extremely important. You have a steel company that's investing in natural gas. Didn't have that before. That's kind of a horizontal mergers and acquisitions. So that's going to continue to go on, and that is basically your traditional joint venture. The second one is who has the greatest amount of cash in the world right now from a financial sponsor perspective? It's the private equity firms.
Yeah.
And you're going to start to see that movement of capital. You've already seen a lot of it, but it's very targeted, and it's very, very narrow at this point.
That's right.
That should open up
That's right.
significantly. But as Kristina said before, and as Jim's company is already doing, it's a quilt. It's all across the board. It's not just in any one area. Liquefied natural gas is changing the game completely. But in terms of investing, in terms of where the need is, it's an entire diversification of the energy chain. And that's what you'll see. It's not any one particular area.
Great.
Let me quickly pick up on this energy independence idea. A lot of people have the impression when you hear that phrase that we'll be insulated from world oil prices, we'll be protected, everything would be within our country. That's not what energy independence to me means. And I don't think it means that to Chris either. But I want to be clear about this because there's a lot of misperception about energy independence. To me, energy independence is simply we are exporting more BTUs than we're importing. And if you think about the coal that we've exported, primarily to Germany, which is shutting down gas plants because gas prices are so high, and we're now starting to do certification of exporting gas because the arb between LNG and Asia and Europe and the US gas prices is huge, and that gap is going to close over time. And we're already exporting refined products. And we're buying less oil because of the tight oil formations that have been developed in the United States. So that combination has got us at a place where we're going to be in a good balanced place in terms of exports and imports of BTUs. And we've never been in that strong a position. Just one last thing. And I heard Rex Tillerson talking about this from ExxonMobil, but we have increased the amount of oil production in the last year more than any time in the history of our country. And I don't think people in America realize how much money's been invested and how much oil has been produced within the United States as a consequence of these new technologies.
You're exactly right about that, to the point about the goalposts on peak oil just keep moving further and further away, right? So. Well, this was a great way to start the discussion. I mean, I think what you all heard was the fact that we have a real energy veteran here, but right now focusing on a startup, the biggest utility in the country, and a fellow who's trying to decide where to put his client's money.
I want to make sure I'm getting some of that money.
Yeah, but I mean, the interesting part of all of that, were the themes pretty much emerged with a lot of commonality, right, from all their perspectives. So I think what we'll do for the time we've got left is I'd like to focus on probably the things that are most top of mind among everybody, whether you're a sophisticated member of the energy markets or whether you're just casually observing, which is, the renewable focus and the shale oil revolution, as we've been calling it, okay? So let's just start out. I got a kind of a two-part question here, and the first part of it I would say is it possible to finance today utility-scale renewable projects? And what are the financing barriers to widespread financing of renewable projects? Most people in the country want to see more development,
right,
whether it's hydro or otherwise, right? And we always talk about the megawatts of these projects being relatively small compared to, traditional generation capacity. Right. So what's going on and what can we expect to see?
On utility scale, I mean, again, all you do is negotiate with the utility and you get a 20-year PPA.
Right.
And that's the basis of financing the build out of whether it's a wind farm or a solar facility. The financing on that is pretty straightforward, and there's plenty of money. And particularly if with the thought, just the example I used of $400 million with 15 to 16 to 17% type returns, there's a lot of people who get in line to have that opportunity. So I don't think that's a problem. I think what's interesting is this solar on the rooftop and distributed generation that's emerging, that has a fundamental implication, not just with the generation portfolio in America, but starts to change the value of distribution in America, which has always been thought as an impregnable monopoly. And so the financing of solar on the rooftop, there's a lot of different ideas there, but nobody has discovered the secret sauce to generate real earnings in deploying distributed generation.
Well, I agree with what's going to be quite interesting is the distributed aspect. I would say my experience with hydro is again, it's been more the time that capital is tied up. I agree. These returns are great. I mean, the problem and the great thing about hydro is we upgraded a plant that was built in 1904, continuously running since 1904, a little Westinghouse plant out in Hawaii. So who has the kind of patient capital that wants to wait 100 years or 50 years to get the returns? I mean,
Not at my age.
Jim, you're looking good. You're going to live a long time. So when we look at this, we started with this little plant, and I wanted to I want to go through the process of building a power plant so I understand what all the problems are. Do I understand all the problems? And when you go into a new industry, a startup, you want to have a barrier to entry. Boy, is there a barrier to entry. But having said all that, we bought a permit last August that had been in process since 2007. And we broke ground by February. We didn't have a FERC, we didn't have an Army Corps 404, 408, we didn't have water quality certification from the state. We had nothing from that. We did have a FERC license, but that's just a license to really have some fun. So, we did the design, we ordered the equipment, it's being built right now. But it was only $15 million. So where do you get, folks that have the kind of money, they don't want, 15 million is sort of in that valley of death amount of money. They want 50 to 100 million or billions to be put to work. It's too big, the equity piece, for an angel, and it's too small for really a private equity, so you go to a bank. So I went to a local bank. The bank was great. But the financing fees from a small bank, that hasn't done hydro before, so it's viewed as a really risky investment, that's fine. They were great, and they were a fantastic partner without them. We then got a USDA loan guarantee for 70%, and then, I'm guaranteeing personally, which, is a little scary. Darn thing better produce electricity. But
It's going to be a whole lot better than that 1% you're getting.
yeah, exactly. So we went from a project that started out at 6%, and now we're in the high teens, low 20s, because of the efficiencies that we were able with this team to bring to it. Now, the question is, how do we get that to scale? Because we think we understand now how to move these projects, but it's getting it to scale, and that's tough.
Yeah, what are other prospects for bundling or aggregation in that industry?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of prospects, and I think it's a matter of, so here's the other problem. People who get these assets, they don't trade them. So when we go to Wall Street, which we've done, and we look at that, they want to go, well, how many trades were done in the last 5-10 years? Well, not a lot.
Yeah.
And then if I want to go get a PPA, and what Jim said, there are so many things that you said that were just great. Different parts of the country where you have the rivers, the Kentucky River, the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, where all these locks and dams and dams are located, aren't necessarily in places that have a capacity market. And on our little project, we signed the PPA a week before the PJM capacity market came out. We're plunged from $136 per megawatt day to $59. That's killer. That means you're not going to build anything. So you can't afford to tie up for 20 years a PPA when it's going for $35 per megawatt hour in the Midwest. I can't build for that. Not at $2,000 a kW, which is what hydro, probably solar and wind are pretty similar. Now, I think what people haven't done, and I think this is quite exciting, is that we haven't really gotten together and integrated this. So if you look at the variability of wind, solar, and hydro, by taking a balancing region that's large enough, I think all of them play together. But the problem is that the policies haven't recognized that. So hydropower gets half the production tax credits of wind and solar. We don't get makers of 5 years. we're 20-year depreciation. And so I know that you're talking about, in the depreciation in 5 years, accelerated bonus depreciation was helpful in building. We don't have any of those breaks. So if we could at least level that playing field and then learn how to integrate them so that they fill in during the variability, I think that would be huge for the country. And I don't see anybody doing that anywhere in the world.
Chris?
Yeah. So to that point, there's a couple of things there. I suspect that that's one of the reasons, hopefully, why the whole MLP structure and maybe the REIT structure will be a good one to utilize to be able to kind of break through what hasn't been done, particularly on the hydro side and renewables in general, to be able to get that access to capital. But what is building very fast right now from an investment perspective is two things. In the venture capital world, outside of what Kristina's doing, but the venture capital, we were just out in San Francisco recently, and you always hear about the internet, and you always hear about the next Facebook, and how to move your hand around a screen that you saw on the CNBC today and draw pictures. But the biggest one that's going on right now is the battery and storage of the renewable energy. And how do we actually create batteries that are enabled to handle the actual sheer force of the energy, that when you actually build or retrofit a plant, you're able to actually store it and then ultimately distribute it out. So that's the biggest area right now in energy in the VC world. On the more private equity side, you're absolutely right, Kristina. The big funds are not going down to that level. But what is happening is hedge funds have figured out that they can't. If there's any hedge funds managers in there, you guys are smart. But the ones I'm talking about are not in this room. If they haven't been able to figure out how to extract returns in an environment where a yield curve is what it is. And when they don't have the ability to lever up an investment, because everybody does their due diligence and they understand that that's not a good thing in the end, they have to go to the private side of the equation. So energy assets, the acquisition of energy assets from a hedge fund is the new thing for them. That's one thing. And they're doing these little credit facilities. So the hedge fund will actually take on a credit facility, raise a little bit of capital, might knock on your door, Kristina, and say, hey, I know you're an expert in blank. I want an equity piece. I'll loan you some of this, and I also want a particular carry. That's a huge new movement. You're going to read a lot about it. The smart players are in there, and then the mass consumer society and the hedge fund space probably will get there in the next few years.
Chris, could I ask you a question on that? Isn't that mostly just true in the energy assets like oil and gas because of the MLP? So you're not going to, and we've talked to a lot of the smart hedge fund guys that are in the room, and or not. And they're just, until we get that done, it's going to be tough. Now, people are asking for letters from IRS to read certain things, and certainly a hydropower dam and maybe the powerhouse and maybe certain aspects of it can be permanent property and qualify. But right now, it's until that happens, I think it's going to be tough to see it in the renewable.
Yeah, it's very limited. Absolutely.
So let's we have a little bit of time left. We're going to take some questions at the end. So I just want to get through one more phase of this discussion. Let's move to the shale business for a moment. Some of you already discussed it. It is, and I see it and from my perspective in the business, it's changing everything. But one of the things that we haven't really gotten our arms around yet is getting the gas from where it is to where it's needed. I'm seeing people, trading companies, for example, trying to interpose themselves in this business and locking up all the rail cars in the Midwest so they can, right, and that kind of stuff going on. So what we're seeing ultimately down the road is a real need for investment in infrastructure, gathering systems, storage systems, transportation systems, getting all of that wonderful stuff from North Dakota to where it's needed, right, in other places. So what do you all see happening in that space? And the subsidiary question, and I'll pipe down, is we are seeing a tremendous interest in investing in U.S. assets from abroad. Yeah. Tremendous interest. Yeah. In fact, they're trying to use us as lawyers, as investment bankers. What do you see out there? Bring us deals, please, right? And so is there a marriage here that could be made, or what do you see going on there? Maybe, Jim.
Yeah, I would start by simply saying, to finish the story on how the Shale Revolution happened, George Mitchell was very focused. And he believed that you go to 2 to 3 miles down in unconventional formations, you could find it, and you could frack it. And what really developed was a combination of horizontal drilling, versus the ability to frack in formations. We've always fracked. Boone Pickens loves to say we've been fracking forever.
That's what drilling is.
Yeah, but he's kind of wrong. We've not always been fracking at that depth and that kind of formation. And so that is what we've really learned how to do.
Right.
And that is transformative. And I think we're learning to use the right chemicals and report them and be transparent. And so I think it's really transforming. MLPs work for all the midstream build out, for the gathering. I mean, I don't believe the people, I mean, I understand the value of tight oil, but I do not believe you should be flaring gas in the process. You ought to cap that well until you
Right.
can build a gathering system to gather the gas. It's just a huge waste of resources to do that in America. But Shell has changed everything and all the mechanisms. I think of the companies like Kinder Morgan, for one, Devon, I go through the list of them. They're in the business of building the transport, particularly Kinder Morgan, of really building the infrastructure that moves the gas from the field to the pipelines. And they even operate the pipelines and get it to market, to the places where it's used. So the capability to do that is there. The money is flowing to that in a huge way now. It's only in the power sector where they haven't opened the door to MLP type of investment.
Right.
And so I think the shale gas is going to be fully utilized in this country. And in terms of foreign investment, the Chinese want to invest in the United States, but we're not letting them. I know because I brought 2 projects to the government. One was with a Japanese partner to do renewable, one with a Chinese partner. And they didn't say no, but they put the conditions on the Chinese partner such that no partner would ever do a deal with those conditions. And that's a huge mistake. And in our $6 billion credit facility, the Chinese came in for $700 million. They have never came in. And that was during the period when all the European banks were weak and were not investing in credit facilities in the United States.
Well, they used to be the big players.
They used to be the big players, and they're out. And so we need to be smart about this and build a collaborative relationship with the Chinese to take advantage of the capital that they have and to take advantage of technology development. And it's a myth to think the Chinese only copy and don't innovate.
Yeah.
They innovate. And so the fact they lead the world in solar panel production as well as in wind turbines, they're going to continue to lead in these areas. We need to open the doors to allow them to invest here in the United States.
Well, that's a good segue then into one of the other key issues involving shale, which is the Shale Gas Revolution, which is the whole concept of U.S. exports. And I would take it from some of your comments that you'd be a big fan of making sure that we're exporting it. But what does everybody think about that?
I'll take it from the investment side. So, somebody mentions the energy revolution. If you're not in the area, you immediately think, how do I get access to the commodity? How can I invest in the commodity, whether it's LNG or renewable or whatever? It's actually the infrastructure, as you mentioned before, around it. So you can do it in the public space, obviously through the pipelines. Those were a search for yield investment at first. They will become a growth investment as we move forward. But if you just think about the boring engineering, engineering's not boring, but the boring.
We move dirt good.
So the boring engineering companies that are building, port systems, storage tanks, the ability to dredge an entire port system to get the ships in that can handle this stuff to export it out. This is going to take a while, but it's happening. It's going to need a little policy change to make it quicker. But these are the boring engineering and construction companies that used to build bridges and other things, and they're now transforming themselves and their growth outlook into something else, and there's a lot of companies that are involved in this. And you look at the railroads. I know it had traditionally nothing to really do with liquefied natural gas or the shale players and bringing the Bakken down to other parts, but you see Buffett in his stake in BNSF, and then you take a look at Union Pacific and some of these other companies that are trying to invest $50 million to change their fleets to be able to handle this stuff. This is something that really private enterprise can figure it out. It's happening quicker than anyone expects. It's all about the infrastructure. So the shale is the largest artery in the heart of the energy equation.
So one quick point. The people in the chemical industry, in the steel industry, in the fertilizer industry who believe in free trade don't believe in free trade for natural gas.
Well, that's a funny phenomenon. Right?
And that is a very important point because they take the position we shouldn't export it. And the cost of export facilities are billions of dollars. It takes 20-year, 30-year contracts to build them. The reality is not that many export terminals are going to get built, and it's not going to really affect significantly the price of natural gas in the U.S.
Well, the irony of that anyway is that as the price of natural gas wallows around at some pretty unattractive level for producers,
Oh, it's attractive for them at $4.
$4,
Yeah.
but it but it was it was
That's
That's
right.
a two.
two. It was a two for a while.
That's a buyer.
Yeah.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
a buyer.
But it'll inhibit investment at a certain point, right?
I'll just say maybe a word about exporting on the renewable side. I think that an area where exciting engineering companies, like mine and Jim's, really could play, and that is there's about 3,000 suppliers in a hydropower plant, and there's about 5,000 small suppliers in a wind. So I think aggregating those to make them more modular, I should say. And then what I still believe that the U.S. is best in the world in many things. And one of them is our design, modeling, high-performance computing, where no one's, in my view, has really tackled the microgrid and mini-grid in such a way that we export the design as well as the modules that set them up so that when emerging countries are coming into their energy systems, that they're not outdated by migrating to something else, and we've lost all that investment for the country. So I think that that's a place where we really should be looking at exporting is both the design as well as the implementation on a modular basis.
So let's take a few questions because we've only got about 10 minutes left. So, sir.
Dr. Johnson, I'm very impressed with your background, and I'm glad that you're the high priestess for hydro. But I'm really interested in how frustrating it must be to have been with the administration because the energy policy just seems to be non-existent.
Well, I must say I had a blast. It was a very exhilarating time because we deployed about $37 billion in support for all kinds of energy. Fossil fuel, renewables. We doubled the amount of renewables in this country. We actually licensed. I think this is one of our singular accomplishments that we don't really talk about, and that is the ability to license a small modular reactor. So when you think that the U.S. has lost, in really North America, there's no more large foragings. So we can make really large containment vessels here. So they have to be done elsewhere. If we make a small modular reactor, 300 megawatts, we could actually build them here, factory build, as opposed to stick on-site, which would reduce the cost. So I found it to be a pretty exciting time and pretty exhausting time. It took me a little while to recover because we were working as hard as we could. So, it's... I think there are some things, having said that we could privatize, and that would be helpful and probably get things a little more efficient.
That would be great.
I want to build on just briefly. This has all been about finance so far, which is great. This is Aspen. I'm Andy Rifkin. I write about the environmental side of it as well.
Yeah.
And one thing that I want to be sure you touch on is you talked about those three wedges, the third, nuclear, third.
Yeah.
Nuclear. Is there anyone on this stage who thinks there's a serious prospect of financing nuclear, even small modular, in this country going forward? And then the other question is about Obama. No one mentioned his speech. Do you think if those restrictions go forward on CO2 from power plants, how does that change the financial landscape?
Well, let me come back to that because I think I did mention my former boss at least once. Please, let's be on the record for what he said on Tuesday, which is doubling down on doubling renewables by 2018. And then also increasing efficiency. And so it was the comment that federal government will buy 20% of their electricity from renewables, right? And said that actually if we did just hydropower, we could green all of it. So, actually I don't think it's so small. So I think that a lot of what is going to make us successful is really being in the trenches, just day in and day out, doing what we can, doing the kinds of things. I mean, Jim, I saw a statistic yesterday, which I wanted to compliment you and your leadership at Duke, because 1.1 pounds per kilowatt hour is what Duke exhibits, whereas the top AEP, well, I shouldn't mention, other companies are more almost at 2 pounds per CO2 in the atmosphere per kW. And I think that that's something that, kilowatt hour, excuse me. So I think that that's something really important. And I think it's because of the investments in a third, as Jim talked about, that we really need to strive for. So I forget what the first part of your question was. I obviously didn't want to answer that right away, so I went to the second part.
Let me touch the nuclear question, because there's 4 nuclear units
that
being
would
built today, two in Georgia, 2 in South Carolina. The regulatory environment is a lot more supportive of nuclear there. And in fact, our operations in the South are about 50% nuclear. And that's one of the reasons that we have such a low carbon content to the kilowatt hours that we sell. But nuclear in the future will be built on a regional basis. 3 to 4 companies will come together and build it that way. Small modular is coming, but the bottom line is we need to build nuclear to replace the existing plants that are retiring, because as I said earlier, 70% of our carbon-free electricity in this country comes from nuclear. And if we do what Germany does, or is doing, which is not smart, they're shutting down all their nuclear and buying coal from the US. And so their emissions are actually going up. And at the end of the day, Germany, Spain, Ontario are examples of people that have failed policies because the timing was wrong and they thought they could turn a long cycle business over in 5 years and fundamentally change it. And it's created a disaster for consumers, because consumers still want affordable electricity as well as clean electricity. We need to get the balance right. Nuclear will be there in the small modular reactors. I really believe that is one of the keys, because I believe that technology will be available by 2025. We don't start shutting down our nuclear plants into the 30s.
In the United States, real quick, think of the nuclear situation, again, I'm the investment person here, as a bond portfolio. When a bond matures, when a nuclear facility matures, it's replaced by a new bond. It's not technically additive. In the emerging markets, the exact opposite. 60% of the outgrowth of nuclear power will be in the emerging markets. So, they're obviously doing the leapfrog technology. They're going away from fixed line telephones directly to cellular. They're doing the same thing in power.
Sir, right there.
I wanted to ask about investment. Do you allow your investing people to buy MLPs as part of portfolios?
Absolutely.
I mean, and I know it's in the, well, you should have diversity, to be sure. But what percent of a portfolio, of the equity portfolio might you have there?
We look at master limited partnerships as the role they play in a portfolio for any equity investor is going to be a bond-like investment as it relates to yield. So we look at it from the standpoint of their yield and what they are transporting. So we want to own master limited partnerships that are transporting the thing that people need, technically liquefied natural gas, to get it to areas where the pipelines obviously can distribute it to, and then make sure that the yield and the valuation of that MLP are attractive enough. Because MLPs have been the asset class of choice for the better part of 2 to 3 years from investors that don't even know how to pronounce it. So you have to be careful, and yields have obviously come way down. They've backed up recently. It's going to be very selective from this point forward, but they do have a very, very good objective in a portfolio.
Okay.
Can I ask you just one more question? In other words, it's not only their yield, but it's the growth. In other words, they've got like a 7 or 8% growth.
Yes.
That's darn important. That's a
No question about it. If you're going to own an MLP just for its yield, then you're going to be whipsawed quite a bit as rates back up in the fixed income market.
Yeah.
Okay. Sir.
Thank you.
My name is Bob Potter, and I'd like to second one of the points that Chris made. I think the most important technology issue in energy is not finding a new alternate energy, but finding a better way to store energy. This electricity in this room has no way to be stored. And this is a challenge that I think is too great for any individual company. But rather than having the government subsidize finding a variety of new ion and chemical alternate energy, the government should be creating an industrial military complex to find a totally new way to store electricity, not just an improved lithium-ion battery or a lead sulfide battery, but find a totally new way to store electricity and do it in a project of the magnitude of the Manhattan Project or the
Yeah.
Apollo Project or the Interstate Highway Project that will bring the industrial capability of the United States to make a battery that I can charge in my car in 10 minutes so I can go 200 miles.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. When I was undersecretary, my boss, Secretary Chu, came up with the hub idea, which is basically the sort of Manhattan-style project all under one roof. And so we run 12 of these where we would get industry as well as universities together, and one of them is in battery storage. One of them is in fuels from sunlight, another one is in solar electricity, one is in building efficiency, which is at Penn State. They took over the old Navy Yard there. So exactly your idea is what the government is supporting through the Department of Energy. So we appreciate that.
I think actually we met. I made that proposal to Secretary Chu in Rochester.
I thought you looked familiar.
But
Right,
you know,
Jim.
there's a tremendous amount going on. Our company alone is testing 7 different battery technology as pilots. Our largest battery is a 34 megawatt battery. We're doing along with the Department of Energy, and it's in West Texas at our No Trees Wind Farm. And when I say it's named appropriately for the area. And it is a tremendous, it's the largest battery in North America, but it also is, we're learning a lot from
Right,
it.
sure.
But I'm reminded of what Thomas Edison said in 1893. He said battery technology will fundamentally change the electric sector, and its development is just around the corner.
Yeah.
So we've been coming around a very long corner for a
Yeah.
long time, but I think we're very close.
But I
Okay.
think,
Battery, you just need a more powerful battery.
don't you think though pump storage really is the way to do utility scale storage?
We have 2,000 megawatts of pump storage in North Carolina, but it's incredibly expensive to build.
Right.
But because of our nuclear fleet, we drive the water up at night,
Yep.
and we use the pump storage during the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, I know there's no time left, but I wanna leave on one point here. $37 trillion to discover, develop, and deliver energy by the year 2035 globally. So 37
Yeah.
trillion, there's nothing bigger need than that. If you could produce something at $3 or $4 and you could sell it at 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 times that, what would you do if you were the government with a deficit and a high debt shelf? What would you do?
Good point. So we are out of time. I'm very sorry. I know there's a lot of questions. I want to have you join me in thanking this panel for really joining us.